They rewrote the family tree without me, crossed out my name from the family business letterhead, and told everyone I was the one who would never amount to anything. But what they didn't know was that while they were playing favorites with Daddy's money, I was building something they could never touch. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of my corner office, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk where contracts worth more than their entire inheritance lay waiting for my signature. They had written me out of their story, but I was about to rewrite the ending in ways they never saw coming. The irony wasn't lost on me as I watched the morning commuters hurry past the building that bore my name in gleaming letters, the same building where my family's law firm rented space on the third floor. They walked beneath my success every single day without knowing it belonged to the daughter they had dismissed as worthless. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister Margaret about the family dinner that weekend, the same dinner where they would discuss father's declining health and the precious will that excluded me entirely. Little did they know I held more power over their future than that yellowed document ever could. The game had changed, but they were still playing by the old rules. I was about to teach them how the new game worked. Before I share the rest of my story, I want to know you are here with me. Just say listening in the comments or let me know where you are. I love hearing how far my story reaches and knowing that someone understands what it feels like to be written off by the people who should love you most. The Hamilton family tree had been carefully curated over 5 generations, each branch meticulously documented in the leather-bound genealogy book that sat in Father's study like a shrine to our bloodline. But if you looked at the most recent pages, you would find something peculiar. My name appeared in faded pencil, easily erased, while my siblings were written in permanent ink with their accomplishments listed in careful script beneath their names. Margaret Hamilton, Harvard Law, Managing Partner at Hamilton and Associates. Thomas Hamilton, Wharton MBA, CEO of Hamilton Industries. Sarah Hamilton, Yale Medicine, Chief of Surgery at Presbyterian Hospital. And then there was me, Emma Hamilton, with nothing but empty space where my achievements should have been recorded. The erasure had been methodical and complete. When I was 22 and struggling to find my way, they removed my name from the family business incorporation papers. When I was 25 and living in a studio apartment, they took my photograph out of the family portrait that hung in the main hallway. When I was 28 and working 3 jobs to pay off student loans, they stopped including me in the annual Christmas card that went out to all their important contacts and clients. By the time I turned 30, I had become the family ghost, present at mandatory gatherings, but invisible in all the ways that mattered. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It began with small disappointments and grew into a canyon of dismissal that seemed impossible to cross. I remember the exact moment I realized I had been officially written off. It was Thanksgiving dinner, and Uncle Robert was asking about everyone's careers. Margaret spoke about her latest high-profile case, Thomas bragged about his company's quarterly earnings, and Sarah described a groundbreaking surgery she had performed. When Uncle Robert turned to me with polite interest, my father actually interrupted before I could speak. He said I was still figuring things out and changed the subject to the upcoming renovations at the family lake house. The lake house renovations were funded by the family trust, the same trust that had been established to ensure each Hamilton child would have a secure financial foundation. The same trust that somehow never seemed to have funds available when I needed help with medical bills or car repairs or the deposit on a decent apartment. Margaret had used her portion to buy a penthouse in the city. Thomas had used his to expand his business operations. Sarah had used hers to fund her medical research. My portion, according to Father, was being held until I proved I could be responsible with money. Proving responsibility to the Hamilton family required meeting very specific criteria. You needed a prestigious degree from an Ivy League school, a career that generated both wealth and social status, a marriage to someone from an equally prominent family, and most importantly, you needed to contribute to the Hamilton legacy in a way that enhanced the family reputation. I had failed on every single count, or so they believed. My degree was from a state school. My career path had been unconventional. I had never married, and worst of all, I had dared to suggest that maybe the family business practices weren't as ethical as they pretended. The ethical concerns had been the final straw that broke their tolerance for my continued presence in family decisions. During a heated discussion about a proposed merger that would eliminate hundreds of jobs, I had voiced my opposition based on the human cost involved. Margaret had called me naive. Thomas had labeled me idealistic and impractical. Sarah had suggested I didn't understand the complexities of business decisions. Father had simply said that until I built something of value myself, my opinions on business matters were irrelevant. That night, I had gone home to my cramped apartment and made a decision that would change everything. If they wanted me to build something of value, I would build an empire. If they thought I lacked business acumen, I would master every aspect of finance and law and strategic planning. If they believed I was destined for failure, I would succeed so completely that they would have no choice but to acknowledge what I had accomplished. But I would do it quietly, methodically, and completely outside their sphere of influence. The first step had been education, but not the kind they would have recognized or approved of. While they were networking at country club events and charity galas, I was studying contract law at night. While they were taking family vacations to European capitals, I was learning about international finance and currency markets. While they were attending society weddings and building connections with other wealthy families, I was building relationships with venture capitalists and entrepreneurs who cared more about results than pedigree. My real education began with a chance encounter at a coffee shop near the university. I was studying for my evening paralegal certification classes when a woman at the next table was having an animated phone conversation about a startup company that needed legal documentation help. She was frustrated because her regular attorney was too expensive for the company's limited budget. I overheard enough to realize I could help, and despite my natural introversion, I introduced myself and offered my services. That woman was Dr. Patricia Chin, a biotechnology researcher who had developed a revolutionary water purification system that could transform access to clean drinking water in developing countries. She needed someone who understood both the legal requirements for patent protection and the financial structures necessary to attract investment funding. She needed someone who could work within her budget constraints while maintaining the highest standards of professional competence. Most importantly, she needed someone who shared her vision of using business success to create positive change in the world. Working with Patricia opened doors I hadn't known existed. The biotech industry was filled with brilliant innovators who needed sophisticated legal and financial support, but couldn't afford the prestigious firms that my family's friends used. These entrepreneurs were building companies that would revolutionize healthcare, environmental protection, and sustainable energy. They were creating jobs, solving problems, and generating enormous wealth while making the world measurably better. Within 2 years, I had built a client base of 12 startup companies, each one representing cutting-edge innovation in sectors that would define the future economy. My unofficial law practice was generating more revenue than I had ever imagined possible, but more importantly, it was connected to work that had genuine meaning and impact. While my family was managing the same old money investments and traditional business models their grandfather had established, I was helping to create the technologies and companies that would make their approach obsolete. The transition from freelance legal support to full-scale business consulting happened organically. My clients needed more than document preparation and contract review. They needed strategic planning, financial modeling, investor relations, and operational guidance. I discovered I had an intuitive understanding of how to structure deals that protected everyone's interests while maximizing growth potential. I could see patterns and opportunities that more experienced consultants missed because I approached each situation without preconceived notions about how things should be done. Patricia's company became my first major success story. The water purification technology she had developed attracted attention from environmental groups, government agencies, and humanitarian organizations around the world. When she was ready to scale up production and distribution, she needed a complex financing structure that could accommodate multiple types of investors while maintaining her control over the company's mission and direction. The solution I developed became a model that other social entrepreneurs adopted for their own ventures. The patent portfolio we built around Patricia's technology became the foundation of my first real business acquisition. When a larger corporation tried to develop competing technology that infringed on our patents, the licensing fees and settlement payments generated enough capital for me to begin making strategic investments in other promising startups. Each successful investment created opportunities to support more entrepreneurs, and each new client relationship expanded my network of contacts in industries that were reshaping the global economy. By my 32nd birthday, I was managing investment portfolios worth more than $50 million. By my 34th birthday, that number had grown to over $200 million. By my 36th birthday, I was recognized as one of the most successful venture capitalists in the biotechnology and clean energy sectors, though I maintained a deliberately low public profile. My family had no idea that the daughter they had written off was building wealth that would soon exceed their combined net worth. The irony of my success was that it had been built on exactly the values they had dismissed as naive and impractical. Every investment decision was evaluated not just for financial return, but for positive social impact. Every business partnership was structured to ensure that all stakeholders benefited from success. Every legal strategy was designed to create long-term value rather than short-term advantage. The ethical framework they had mocked as idealistic had become the foundation of a business empire that was growing faster than any traditional investment approach could match. My family's dismissal had taught me something valuable about the difference between inherited wealth and earned success. They had been given their positions and their resources based on family connections and historical advantages. They had never been required to prove their competence or demonstrate their value in competitive situations. They had never risked failure or faced the consequences of poor decisions. Their confidence was based on privilege rather than achievement, and their judgment was clouded by assumptions that had never been tested against reality. The companies I was funding and supporting were solving problems that government agencies and established corporations had failed to address for decades. We were developing technologies that could reverse environmental damage, cure previously untreatable diseases, and create sustainable energy systems that could free entire regions from dependence on fossil fuels. We were generating enormous profits while making measurable improvements in human welfare and environmental health. We were proving that ethical business practices were not just morally superior, but also financially superior to the extractive and exploitative models that had dominated previous generations. The legal strategies I had mastered while supporting my clients became the tools I used to begin acquiring assets that would eventually give me leverage over my family's financial future. Corporate debt instruments, real estate investments, and partnership agreements could be structured in ways that created multiple pathways to ownership and control. Patient capital and strategic timing could turn small initial investments into controlling interests in much larger enterprises. The same skills that had made me valuable to innovative entrepreneurs could be applied to traditional businesses that were struggling to adapt to changing market conditions. My family's law firm had been struggling for several years, though they would never have admitted it publicly. Their client base was aging, their practice areas were becoming less relevant, and their overhead costs were increasing faster than their revenue. They were losing clients to more innovative firms that offered specialized expertise in emerging legal areas like intellectual property, international finance, and technology transfer. They were spending more on maintaining their prestigious office space and traditional marketing approaches than they were generating in new business development. The building where Hamilton and Associates maintained their offices was owned by a real estate investment trust that had been assembled by a consortium of anonymous investors. The trust had been carefully structured to provide stable returns while maintaining flexibility for future development opportunities. The legal documentation was complex enough that most tenants had no idea who actually owned their office space or how decisions about lease terms and building improvements were made. My family had been focused on their rent payments and had never investigated the ownership structure of their most significant business expense. Thomas's manufacturing company had been facing similar challenges in adapting to changing market conditions and increased competition from international suppliers. The solution he had chosen was to expand operations by acquiring smaller competitors and consolidating market share in traditional product lines. The expansion required significant capital investment, which he had funded through a combination of bank loans and private investment partnerships. The terms of these financing agreements included provisions that could transfer ownership in the event of payment defaults or performance failures. Sarah's medical research had attracted attention from pharmaceutical companies that were interested in licensing her innovations for commercial development. The licensing agreements she had negotiated generated substantial royalty payments, but they also included complex intellectual property provisions that could be affected by changes in patent law or shifts in regulatory policy. Her research funding came from grants and private donations that were administered through nonprofit organizations with their own governance structures and financial requirements. Margaret's law practice was built on relationships with clients who trusted her expertise in areas like estate planning and corporate law. But the legal profession was changing rapidly as artificial intelligence and automated document preparation made traditional legal services less valuable. Clients were demanding more specialized knowledge and more innovative solutions to complex problems. The billable hour model that had sustained law firms for generations was being challenged by alternative fee structures and competitive pressure from more efficient service providers. Each of my siblings had built their success on foundations that were less secure than they realized. Their businesses depended on market conditions, regulatory environments, and competitive advantages that could shift without warning. Their wealth was concentrated in assets that were tied to specific industries and geographic regions. Their professional reputations were connected to client relationships that could be disrupted by changes in technology or economic conditions. They had achieved impressive success within traditional frameworks, but they had not adapted to the new realities that were reshaping every aspect of the modern economy. My approach had been fundamentally different from the beginning. Instead of trying to succeed within existing systems, I had identified emerging opportunities that established players were overlooking or dismissing. Instead of concentrating wealth in single industries or asset classes, I had built diversified portfolios that could benefit from multiple types of market changes. Instead of relying on family connections and inherited advantages, I had created value through innovation and strategic thinking that could be applied in many different contexts. The network of relationships I had built through my work with entrepreneurs and innovators included people who were reshaping industries, creating new markets, and developing solutions to global challenges. These relationships were based on mutual respect and shared success rather than family obligations or social expectations. They were people who valued competence over pedigree, results over reputation, and collaborative problem-solving over competitive advantage. They were building the future while my family was trying to preserve the past. The financial instruments I had mastered while supporting my clients had taught me how to structure investments that could provide multiple types of returns under different market conditions. Convertible securities, option agreements, and strategic partnerships could be designed to create upside potential while limiting downside risk. International diversification and currency hedging could protect wealth from regional economic disruptions. Alternative investment strategies could generate returns that were uncorrelated with traditional market performance. The real estate investments I had made were concentrated in properties that would benefit from long-term demographic and technological trends. Urban development projects in growing metropolitan areas would appreciate as population density increased. Commercial properties in emerging technology centers would benefit from increasing demand for specialized office and laboratory space. Residential developments in communities with strong educational systems and employment opportunities would attract buyers who were building wealth through innovation and entrepreneurship. The intellectual property portfolios I had helped my clients develop were generating licensing revenues and creating barriers to competition that would provide sustainable competitive advantages for decades. Patent protection for breakthrough technologies in healthcare, environmental solutions, and energy systems would ensure that the innovators who developed these solutions would benefit from their commercial success. Trademark and brand development would create market recognition that could be leveraged across multiple product lines and geographic markets. My family had always measured success in terms of annual income, net worth, and social status within their established peer group. They had never considered the possibility that entirely new forms of wealth creation were emerging that would make their traditional approaches obsolete. They had never imagined that the daughter they had dismissed could master skills they didn't understand and build success in markets they had never explored. They had never considered that their own financial security might someday depend on decisions made by someone they had written out of their family story. The phone call from Margaret about father's health had marked the beginning of the endgame I had been preparing for without fully realizing it. His declining condition meant that the family would soon be dealing with estate planning, inheritance distribution, and the transfer of business assets to the next generation. The will that excluded me would become the document that defined our relationships for the rest of our lives, unless something fundamental changed about the balance of power within the family structure. But the balance of power had already changed in ways they couldn't imagine. The assets they thought they controlled were connected to financial structures I had helped create. The businesses they thought they owned were dependent on agreements I had negotiated. The wealth they thought they had inherited was protected by legal frameworks I had designed. They had been playing checkers while I had been playing chess, and the game was almost over. The dinner invitation from Margaret included the familiar tone of obligation disguised as affection that had characterized our family interactions for years. She expected me to show up, sit quietly while they discussed important matters, and accept whatever scraps of attention or inclusion they were willing to offer. She had no idea that I would be arriving at that dinner as the most financially powerful person at the table. She had no idea that the future they were planning without me was actually a future I controlled more than they did. The morning sun was climbing higher outside my office windows, casting new shadows across the contracts that would finalize the last pieces of my strategy. The building directory in the lobby listed Hamilton and Associates on the third floor, just as it had for 15 years. But the ownership documents filed with the city showed a different story, one that would become clear very soon. The family tree they had rewritten without me was about to be rewritten again, and this time I would be holding the pen. My assistant knocked on the door and entered with the final legal documents that needed my signature before the weekend. The papers represented months of careful planning and years of patient investment. Each signature would transfer another piece of the puzzle into place, creating a web of ownership and control that would reshape my family's understanding of power and value. They had taught me that success was measured by your ability to exclude others from opportunity. I was about to teach them that real success was measured by your ability to create opportunities that others never saw coming. The car service would arrive in an hour to take me to the family dinner where everything would change. I had chosen my outfit carefully, something that would command respect without revealing the extent of my transformation. I had prepared my words even more carefully, phrases that would convey strength without aggression, confidence without arrogance, and power without cruelty. They had written me out of their story, but I was about to show them that I had been writing a much bigger story all along. The contracts were signed, the strategies were in place, and the moment of revelation was approaching. After 15 years of dismissal and exclusion, after being erased from family trees and business plans and inheritance documents, I was finally ready to show them what the daughter they had underestimated had actually accomplished. The game was about to change, and for the first time in my adult life, I would be the one setting the rules. The transformation from family disappointment to financial powerhouse had taken 12 years of methodical planning and strategic execution that would have impressed even my father if he had bothered to pay attention. While my siblings were building their careers within established frameworks and familiar industries, I was identifying opportunities in sectors they didn't understand and markets they couldn't access. The biotechnology revolution that began in the early 2010s created investment opportunities that traditional wealth managers dismissed as too risky or too complex for serious consideration. My first major breakthrough came through Patricia Chen's water purification company when we secured a development contract with the United Nations Environmental Program. The contract required sophisticated financial structuring to accommodate funding from multiple international sources while meeting regulatory requirements in dozens of different countries. The legal framework I developed became a template that other humanitarian technology companies adopted for their own international expansion projects. The success of that deal established my reputation as someone who could navigate complex multi-jurisdictional agreements that generated both social impact and substantial financial returns. The consulting fees from that first UN contract provided the capital I needed to begin making strategic investments in other early-stage companies that were developing breakthrough technologies. My investment criteria were based on three factors that traditional venture capitalists often overlooked. First, the technology had to address a genuine global problem that affected millions of people. Second, the solution had to be economically sustainable without requiring permanent subsidies or charity funding. Third, the founding team had to demonstrate both technical competence and ethical commitment to using their innovations responsibly. Those criteria led me to investments in companies that were developing affordable solar energy systems for rural communities, biodegradable packaging materials that could replace single-use plastics, and medical diagnostic tools that could function in areas without reliable electricity or internet connectivity. Each of these companies was addressing market opportunities worth billions of dollars, but they were being ignored by mainstream investors who preferred familiar business models in established industries. The solar energy company I funded in 2014 was founded by two engineers who had developed a manufacturing process that could produce photovoltaic panels at half the cost of existing technologies. Their innovation made solar power economically competitive with fossil fuels in regions where traditional energy infrastructure was expensive to build and maintain. The company grew from a small research operation to a major manufacturing enterprise that supplied renewable energy systems to governments and communities across 3 continents. My initial investment of $2 million in that solar company returned over $40 million when the company went public 5 years later. But more importantly, the relationship I developed with the founding team connected me to a network of renewable energy entrepreneurs who were developing the next generation of clean technology solutions. These relationships led to investment opportunities in wind power, energy storage, and smart grid technologies that would transform how electricity was generated, distributed, and consumed around the world. The packaging company I supported was addressing the global crisis of plastic pollution by developing materials that could decompose safely in natural environments while maintaining the durability and cost-effectiveness that made plastic packaging popular with manufacturers and consumers. Their research had implications for industries ranging from food service to medical supplies to electronic components. The intellectual property portfolio we built around their innovations created licensing opportunities with major corporations that needed sustainable alternatives to traditional packaging materials. The medical diagnostics company was developing portable testing equipment that could diagnose infectious diseases, monitor chronic conditions, and screen for genetic disorders using blood samples the size of a pinhead. Their technology made sophisticated medical testing available in rural clinics, refugee camps, and remote communities where traditional laboratory infrastructure was impossible to establish. The humanitarian applications were obvious, but the commercial potential was enormous as healthcare systems worldwide sought ways to reduce costs while improving patient outcomes. Each successful investment created opportunities to support more entrepreneurs and fund more innovations that addressed pressing global challenges while generating substantial financial returns. The investment portfolio I was building represented a new model of capitalism that measured success by both profit margins and positive social impact. The companies I supported were creating jobs, improving lives, and protecting the environment while generating wealth for investors who shared their vision of business as a force for positive change. My family had no idea that their dismissed daughter was pioneering investment strategies that would define the future of sustainable capitalism. They continued to manage their wealth through traditional approaches that focused on extracting maximum returns from established industries without regard for environmental or social consequences. Their investment portfolios were concentrated in fossil fuel companies, pharmaceutical corporations, and financial institutions that profited from maintaining systems that were becoming obsolete. The legal expertise I had developed while supporting my clients became the foundation for more ambitious strategies that would eventually give me influence over traditional businesses and established industries. Corporate law, securities regulation, and international finance were complex fields that required years of study and practical experience to master. But mastering these areas provided tools for creating ownership structures and investment vehicles that could be used to acquire assets and influence decisions in ways that were completely legal but not widely understood. The real estate investment trust that owned my family's office building was one of several investment vehicles I had created to acquire assets that would eventually give me leverage over their business operations. The trust was structured as a consortium of institutional investors that provided stable returns while maintaining operational flexibility for property management and development decisions. The legal documentation was complex enough that most tenants had no way of knowing who actually controlled their leases or determined their rental costs. Acquiring control of the building where Hamilton and Associates maintained their offices had required patience and strategic timing rather than enormous capital investment. The original developers had used debt financing that included provisions for ownership transfer in the event of payment difficulties or performance failures. When the developers encountered cash flow problems during the economic downturn of 2016, I was able to acquire their debt obligations at a significant discount and restructure the financing in ways that gave me effective control over the property. The acquisition strategy one used for their office building became a model for acquiring influence over other assets that were important to my family's business operations and personal wealth. Thomas's manufacturing company had expanded through debt financing that included similar provisions for ownership transfer under certain conditions. Sarah's medical research was funded through grants and donations that were administered by nonprofit organizations with governance structures that could be influenced by strategic board appointments and policy advocacy. Margaret's law practice was dependent on client relationships and professional reputation that could be affected by changes in legal technology, regulatory requirements, and competitive dynamics within the legal profession. The automated document preparation systems and artificial intelligence tools that were transforming legal services represented both threats and opportunities for traditional law firms that were slow to adapt to technological change. My approach to acquiring influence over my family's assets was based on the same principles I used for supporting innovative entrepreneurs. Instead of trying to compete directly with established players, I identified structural vulnerabilities and emerging opportunities that others were overlooking or dismissing. Instead of using aggressive tactics that would create conflict and resistance, I focused on creating value and solving problems in ways that benefited everyone involved. The debt restructuring I negotiated for Thomas's company actually improved his cash flow and reduced his financing costs, while giving me contractual rights that could become important under certain circumstances. The nonprofit organization that administered Sarah's research funding was able to expand its grant-making capacity and improve its operational efficiency through governance reforms I helped design and implement. The technology consulting I provided to Margaret's law firm helped her clients while establishing relationships that could become valuable in the future. My family had taught me that power was about exclusion and dominance, about maintaining advantages that kept others from competing or succeeding. But my experience with innovative entrepreneurs had shown me that real power came from creating value and building relationships that enabled everyone to succeed more effectively than they could alone. The investment strategies I had mastered were based on identifying opportunities for mutual benefit rather than zero-sum competition. The financial instruments I had learned to use while supporting my clients could be applied to traditional businesses and established industries in ways that created new opportunities for growth and innovation. Convertible securities, strategic partnerships, and licensing agreements could be structured to provide multiple types of value under different market conditions. International diversification and alternative investment strategies could protect wealth while creating access to emerging markets and developing technologies. The intellectual property portfolios I had helped my clients develop were generating licensing revenues that provided sustainable competitive advantages and barriers to entry that protected long-term market positions. Patent protection for breakthrough innovations in healthcare, environmental solutions, and energy systems would ensure that the creators of these technologies would benefit from their commercial success for decades. Trademark and brand development created market recognition that could be leveraged across multiple product lines and geographic regions. The network of relationships I had built through my work with entrepreneurs and innovators included people who were reshaping entire industries and creating new markets that would define the future economy. These relationships were based on mutual respect and shared success rather than family obligations or social expectations. They were connections with people who valued competence over credentials, results over reputation, and collaborative problem-solving over competitive advantage. My family's approach to wealth management was based on preserving existing advantages and maintaining traditional power structures that had served previous generations. They invested in companies and industries they understood, maintained relationships with people from similar backgrounds, and measured success by their ability to sustain lifestyles and social positions that demonstrated their superiority to people with less inherited privilege. My approach was fundamentally different because it was based on creating new forms of value that hadn't existed before. The companies I supported were developing technologies that would make existing solutions obsolete. The entrepreneurs I funded were creating markets that established corporations were too slow or too rigid to enter effectively. The innovations I helped protect and commercialize were solving problems that traditional approaches had failed to address for decades. The diversification strategy one had implemented protected my wealth from regional economic disruptions while creating opportunities to benefit from growth in emerging markets and developing economies. The biotechnology companies I supported were addressing healthcare challenges in Africa and Asia that represented enormous market opportunities as these regions developed economic capacity to purchase advanced medical solutions. The renewable energy companies I funded were building infrastructure in Latin America and Eastern Europe that would provide essential services while generating substantial returns for investors. The currency hedging and international finance strategies I had mastered while supporting global entrepreneurs provided protection against economic instability while creating opportunities to benefit from differences in regulatory environments and market conditions between countries. The legal frameworks I had learned to navigate made it possible to structure investments and business operations that could adapt to changing political and economic circumstances without losing value or operational effectiveness. My family's wealth was concentrated in assets that were tied to specific geographic regions and traditional industries that were vulnerable to disruption from technological change and global economic shifts. Their real estate investments were primarily in established metropolitan areas where property values were high but growth potential was limited. Their business investments were concentrated in industries that were mature and increasingly competitive rather than emerging and innovative. The investment portfolio I had built was designed to benefit from long-term trends that would reshape the global economy over the next several decades. Demographic changes, technological advancement, environmental pressures, and social evolution were creating opportunities for investors who could identify and support solutions to emerging challenges. The companies I funded were positioned to benefit from these trends rather than being threatened by them. The social impact investing approach I had pioneered was attracting attention from institutional investors, government agencies, and philanthropic organizations that were looking for ways to address global challenges while generating sustainable financial returns. The investment model I had developed demonstrated that ethical business practices were not just morally superior, but also financially superior to extractive and exploitative approaches that had dominated previous generations of capitalism. The recognition I was receiving from the investment community was establishing my reputation as someone who could identify opportunities that traditional analysts missed and structure deals that created value for all stakeholders involved. The speaking invitations, advisory board appointments, and consulting requests I was receiving connected me to networks of influence that extended far beyond the regional business community where my family had built their reputations. My father's declining health had accelerated the timeline for estate planning and inheritance distribution that would determine how family wealth and business assets were transferred to the next generation. The will that excluded me had been written based on assumptions about my financial situation and business competence that were no longer accurate. But the legal documents that would actually determine control over family assets were more complex than a simple inheritance distribution. The debt obligations, partnership agreements, and ownership structures that governed my family's business operations included provisions that could be triggered by changes in financial circumstances, management capability, or strategic direction. The financing agreements that Thomas had signed for his business expansion included performance requirements and debt service obligations that could transfer ownership if certain conditions were not met. The real estate investments that represented a significant portion of family wealth were subject to market conditions and regulatory changes that could affect their value and liquidity. Margaret's law practice was built on client relationships and professional reputation that could be affected by changes in legal technology, competitive dynamics, and regulatory requirements that were transforming the legal profession. The intellectual property and business methods that had made her practice successful could become less valuable as artificial intelligence and automated systems provided more efficient alternatives to traditional legal services. Sarah's medical research was funded through grants and licensing agreements that included provisions for intellectual property ownership and commercialization rights that could be affected by changes in patent law, regulatory policy, and pharmaceutical industry dynamics. Her professional reputation was tied to research outcomes and publication records that could be influenced by funding availability and collaborative relationships with other researchers and institutions. The strategic positions I had established through my investment activities and legal expertise provided multiple pathways for influencing decisions that would affect my family's financial future. The ownership stakes I held in companies that supplied services to their businesses gave me information about their operational challenges and strategic vulnerabilities. The board positions and advisory relationships I had developed connected me to networks of professionals who could provide expertise and resources that my family might need under changing circumstances. The legal frameworks I had mastered while supporting my clients included strategies for corporate restructuring, debt reorganization, and ownership transfer that could be applied to traditional businesses that were facing competitive pressures or operational challenges. The international business experience I had gained through supporting global entrepreneurs provided knowledge about markets and opportunities that could become important as domestic business conditions became more challenging. The timing of my father's health crisis coincided with market conditions and regulatory changes that would test the resilience of traditional business models and wealth management strategies. The companies and industries that had provided stable returns for previous generations were facing disruption from technological innovation, environmental pressures, and changing consumer preferences that favored sustainable and socially responsible alternatives. My family's assumption that I would remain financially dependent and professionally unsuccessful had prevented them from recognizing the implications of my transformation from family disappointment to influential investor and strategic advisor. They had continued to plan their futures based on outdated information about my capabilities and resources. They had no idea that the daughter they had excluded from inheritance planning had acquired the knowledge and relationships necessary to influence their own financial destinies. The dinner invitation from Margaret represented an opportunity to begin revealing the extent of my transformation in a controlled setting that would allow me to demonstrate my new position without creating unnecessary conflict or embarrassment for family members who had supported my exclusion from family planning. The conversation would need to be carefully managed to convey strength without aggression, confidence without arrogance, and capability without condescension. The documents I had signed that morning completed the legal framework that would give me effective control over assets and agreements that my family considered secure and permanent. The real estate investments, business partnerships, and financing arrangements they depended on were now subject to decisions and policies that I could influence through ownership stakes, board positions, and contractual relationships they were not aware of. The car service was waiting outside my office building as I gathered the materials I would need for the family dinner that would mark the beginning of a new chapter in our relationships. The contracts and legal documents that represented years of patient planning and strategic investment were safely filed away, but their implications would soon become clear to people who had spent decades underestimating my potential for creating change and building influence. The game was about to shift from preparation to revelation, from building power to exercising it, from proving my worth to demonstrating the consequences of their failure to recognize it sooner. They had rewritten the family tree without me, but I had rewritten the financial structures that would determine whether their version of the family story could survive the test of changing circumstances and emerging realities. The Hamilton family estate looked exactly as it had for the past 30 years, with its manicured gardens and imposing colonial architecture that spoke of old money and established tradition. But as my car pulled through the wrought iron gates, I knew this would be the last time I would enter this house as the dismissed daughter seeking acceptance from people who had written me out of their story. Tonight, I would be entering as the person who held more power over their future than they had ever imagined possible. Margaret greeted me at the front door with the same polite distance that had characterized our relationship since I had been officially designated the family disappointment. She looked tired and stressed in ways that made me wonder if she was beginning to understand that their traditional approaches to business and wealth management were becoming less effective in a rapidly changing economy. She led me to the formal dining room where Thomas and Sarah were already seated at the mahogany table that had hosted 5 generations of Hamilton family meetings and celebrations. Father was seated at the head of the table in his wheelchair, looking frail but still maintaining the authoritative presence that had dominated family dynamics for decades. His decline over the past year had been rapid and comprehensive, affecting not just his physical health, but also his ability to maintain active oversight of the business interests and investment strategies that had defined his identity and his power within the family structure. Tonight would be his last opportunity to cement the legacy arrangements that would preserve Hamilton family influence for another generation. The conversation began with the usual pleasantries and updates about professional achievements that reinforced the hierarchy of success and recognition that had always defined our family gatherings. Margaret discussed her latest high-profile legal cases and the expansion of her client base into new practice areas that were generating substantial revenue for Hamilton and Associates. Thomas described the international contracts he had secured for his manufacturing company and the production improvements that were increasing his profit margins despite growing competition from overseas suppliers. Sarah shared news about her medical research grants and the pharmaceutical licensing agreements that were generating royalty payments while advancing treatments for diseases that affected millions of patients worldwide. Her work was gaining recognition from medical organizations and government agencies that were interested in supporting innovations that could reduce healthcare costs while improving patient outcomes. She had been invited to present her findings at international conferences and collaborate with research institutions across multiple countries. When the conversation turned to me, I could see the familiar expressions of polite obligation that had always accompanied their attempts to include me in family discussions about achievement and success. They expected me to share news about whatever small job or modest project I was currently pursuing, something that would justify my presence at the table without challenging their assumptions about my limited potential for meaningful accomplishment. Instead, I began by thanking them for maintaining family traditions that had taught me valuable lessons about the importance of building something lasting and meaningful. I told them that their example had inspired me to focus on creating value that would endure beyond my own lifetime and contribute to positive change in the world. I explained that I had spent the past 12 years developing expertise in areas that would define the future of business and investment, though I had chosen to work quietly without seeking recognition or publicity that might interfere with my effectiveness. The shift in their attention was immediate and noticeable as they began to realize that my tone and confidence were different from anything they had heard from me before. Margaret's expression changed from polite tolerance to genuine curiosity as she asked about the specific areas where I had been focusing my professional development. Thomas leaned forward with interest that seemed uncharacteristic given his usual dismissal of my career prospects and business understanding. I began by describing my work with biotechnology companies that were developing breakthrough innovations in healthcare, environmental protection, and sustainable agriculture. I explained how these companies were addressing global challenges that government agencies and established corporations had failed to solve for decades, while creating market opportunities worth hundreds of billions of dollars for investors who understood their potential. The technologies I had helped develop and commercialize were being adopted by organizations worldwide that needed solutions to problems that traditional approaches could not address. Sarah's medical background enabled her to understand the significance of the diagnostic technologies and therapeutic innovations I had supported through strategic investment and legal guidance. Her questions about specific companies and research outcomes revealed that she was familiar with several of the breakthrough treatments that had emerged from my investment portfolio, though she had not previously known about my role in supporting their development and commercialization. Thomas began asking more detailed questions about the business models and financial structures that had enabled these biotechnology companies to achieve rapid growth while maintaining focus on social impact and environmental responsibility. His manufacturing experience helped him appreciate the complexity of scaling production systems and managing international supply chains while meeting regulatory requirements in multiple countries. He seemed genuinely impressed by the operational challenges that had been successfully addressed through the strategic planning and legal frameworks I had helped design. Margaret's legal expertise allowed her to understand the sophisticated intellectual property strategies and international partnership agreements that had protected these innovations while enabling their global distribution and commercialization. She recognized the complexity of the legal structures that were necessary to coordinate funding from multiple sources while maintaining operational control and ensuring that innovations would be used responsibly and ethically. Father listened to this discussion with growing attention and interest that seemed to reflect his realization that I had developed knowledge and capabilities that none of them had previously recognized or acknowledged. His questions became more focused and strategic as he began to understand that my work represented a fundamentally different approach to business and investment that was generating both substantial financial returns and measurable social impact. The conversation continued for over an hour as I shared more details about the investment portfolio I had built and the network of relationships I had developed with entrepreneurs, researchers, and institutional investors who were pioneering new models of sustainable capitalism. The companies I had supported were addressing market opportunities in renewable energy, environmental remediation, sustainable agriculture, and advanced manufacturing that would define economic growth for the next several decades. When Thomas asked about the scale of the investments I had been making, I explained that my portfolio had grown to over $500 million in managed assets, with returns that had consistently exceeded traditional investment benchmarks while maintaining focus on environmental sustainability and social responsibility. The diversification across multiple industries and geographic regions provided protection against market volatility while creating opportunities to benefit from long-term trends that were reshaping the global economy. The silence that followed this revelation was profound and uncomfortable as my family began to process the implications of what I had just shared with them. Margaret was the first to speak, asking how I had acquired the capital necessary to make investments of this magnitude given what they knew about my financial situation and employment history. Her question was posed with professional curiosity rather than skepticism, as if she was beginning to understand that her assumptions about my capabilities had been fundamentally incorrect. I explained that my initial capital had come from consulting fees and legal services I had provided to early-stage companies that needed sophisticated expertise, but could not afford the rates charged by established firms. The success of these companies had generated returns that enabled me to make larger investments in additional startups that were developing breakthrough technologies. Each successful investment had created opportunities to support more entrepreneurs and fund more innovations that addressed pressing global challenges while generating substantial financial returns. Sarah asked about the timeline for this transformation and how I had managed to build expertise in areas that were completely outside my formal educational background and early career experience. I described the years of intensive study and practical learning that had been necessary to understand biotechnology research, international finance, patent law, and strategic business development. The education I had pursued was focused on solving real problems for innovative companies rather than earning credentials or building reputation within established professional communities. Thomas wanted to understand how my investment approach differed from traditional venture capital and private equity strategies that focused primarily on financial returns without regard for social impact or environmental consequences. I explained that the companies I supported were selected based on their potential to address global challenges while generating sustainable profits, and that this approach had actually produced superior financial performance compared to conventional investment strategies that ignored long-term risks and opportunities. Father's questions became more direct and challenging as he began to understand that I had built wealth and influence that potentially exceeded what any of them had achieved through their traditional career paths and inherited advantages. He asked about my plans for the future and whether I intended to continue working quietly or begin taking a more public role in the business and investment communities where I had been building relationships and generating results. I told them that my preference had always been to focus on creating value rather than seeking recognition, but that circumstances were changing in ways that would require me to take more visible leadership roles in organizations and initiatives that were addressing global challenges through innovative business solutions. The expertise I had developed and the network of relationships I had built were becoming resources that could be used to influence policy decisions and strategic directions at national and international levels. Margaret asked whether my investment activities had included any acquisitions or strategic positions that might affect traditional businesses or established industries. Her question seemed to reflect a growing awareness that the changes I had been describing might have implications for their own business operations and financial security that they had not previously considered. I explained in that my investment strategy had indeed included positions in companies and organizations that provided services to traditional businesses, including real estate investment trusts, technology consulting firms, and financial services companies that were helping established enterprises adapt to changing market conditions and regulatory requirements. These investments were designed to create value for all stakeholders involved while providing me with information about market trends and business challenges that could affect multiple industries. Thomas asked specifically whether any of my investments might affect his manufacturing company or the suppliers and customers that were critical to his business operations. I told him that my portfolio included companies that were developing sustainable manufacturing technologies and supply chain management systems that could help traditional manufacturers reduce costs while improving environmental performance. These innovations represented opportunities for collaboration rather than competitive threats. Sarah inquired about potential connections between my biotechnology investments and the pharmaceutical companies that were licensing her research and providing funding for her ongoing projects. I explained that several companies in my portfolio were developing technologies that could enhance the effectiveness and reduce the costs of drug development and medical research, creating opportunities for partnerships that could benefit all parties involved. Father's final question was whether my financial position and business relationships had given me any influence over the assets and agreements that affected Hamilton family wealth and business operations. His tone suggested that he was beginning to understand that the power dynamics within our family might be different from what he had previously assumed. I took a deep breath and began to explain that my investment activities had indeed created positions that could influence decisions affecting their business operations and financial security. The real estate investment trust that owned the building where Hamilton and Associates maintained their offices was controlled by a consortium of investors that included my financial vehicles. The debt restructuring I had negotiated for Thomas's business expansion had included provisions that gave me contractual rights that could become important under certain circumstances. The nonprofit organization that administered Sarah's research funding had been strengthened through governance reforms and operational improvements that I had helped design and implement. The technology consulting services that were helping Margaret's law firm adapt to changing legal technologies and client expectations were provided by companies in my investment portfolio that specialized in supporting traditional professional service firms. The revelation that I held strategic positions that could influence their business operations and financial futures created a moment of stunned silence that seemed to stretch for several minutes. Margaret was the first to speak, asking whether I had deliberately targeted their assets and agreements as part of some elaborate revenge strategy designed to punish them for excluding me from family planning and inheritance decisions. I explained that my investment decisions had been based on identifying opportunities to create value and solve problems rather than seeking control or revenge against family members who had underestimated my potential. The positions I had acquired were the natural result of pursuing sound business strategies that generated returns while supporting innovations that addressed global challenges. The fact that these positions created influence over their assets was a consequence of their own business decisions rather than deliberate targeting on my part. Thomas asked whether my strategic positions meant that I now controlled their business operations or could force changes in their management decisions and operational strategies. I assured him that my investment approach was based on collaboration and mutual benefit rather than dominance or control, and that my goal was to help traditional businesses adapt to changing market conditions rather than displacing or destroying established operations. Sarah wanted to understand whether my influence over her research funding could affect her ability to continue her medical research or commercialize her innovations through existing licensing agreements. I explained that the governance improvements I had supported were designed to strengthen the organization's capacity to support medical research rather than restricting or controlling the research directions that were pursued by individual investigators. Margaret's legal training enabled her to ask more sophisticated questions about the specific contractual provisions and ownership structures that gave me influence over their assets and operations. Her questions revealed that she understood the complexity of the legal frameworks involved and recognized that my positions had been acquired through legitimate business transactions rather than unethical manipulation or exploitation. Father asked whether I expected them to change their business strategies or family relationships in response to my revelation about the influence I had acquired over their financial futures. His questions seemed to reflect both concern about potential demands I might make and respect for the strategic thinking and business competence I had demonstrated through my investment activities. I told them that my expectations were simple and straightforward. I wanted to be included in family discussions and planning processes as an equal participant whose opinions and expertise were valued and respected. I wanted recognition for the accomplishments I had achieved and the contributions I could make to addressing challenges that affected the entire family. Most importantly, I wanted relationships that were based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than obligation and polite tolerance. I explained that the wealth I had built and the influence I had acquired were resources that could benefit the entire family if we could work together constructively and collaboratively. The expertise I had developed in emerging technologies and sustainable business practices could help their traditional enterprises adapt to changing market conditions and competitive pressures. The network of relationships I had built could provide access to opportunities and resources that were not available through conventional business channels. The conversation that followed was different from any family discussion we had ever had before. For the first time in my adult life, my siblings and father were genuinely interested in my opinions and perspectives on business strategies and investment decisions. They asked detailed questions about market trends and technological developments that could affect their industries and professional activities. They wanted to understand how sustainable business practices and social impact investing could be integrated into their existing operations and investment portfolios. Margaret expressed regret about the years of dismissal and exclusion that had prevented the family from benefiting from my expertise and capabilities. She acknowledged that their assumptions about my potential had been based on outdated criteria that failed to recognize emerging forms of value creation and business success. She asked whether I would be willing to work with her law firm to develop expertise in legal areas that were becoming increasingly important as businesses adapted to technological change and evolving regulatory requirements. Thomas admitted that his manufacturing company was facing competitive pressures and operational challenges that required innovative solutions he was not equipped to develop independently. He asked whether my investment portfolio included companies that could provide technologies or strategic guidance that could help traditional manufacturers improve their performance while reducing their environmental impact and social costs. Sarah recognized that her medical research could benefit from connections to biotechnology companies and investment networks that understood the commercial potential of breakthrough healthcare innovations. She asked whether my experience with technology transfer and licensing agreements could help her maximize the impact of her research while ensuring that resulting treatments would be accessible to patients who needed them regardless of their economic circumstances. Father's response was perhaps the most significant change in our family dynamics. He asked whether I would be willing to take an active role in family estate planning and wealth management decisions that would affect future generations of Hamilton descendants. His question represented recognition that my expertise and resources had made me the most financially sophisticated member of the family, capable of providing guidance that could protect and enhance family wealth more effectively than traditional approaches. The remainder of the evening was spent discussing specific opportunities for collaboration and mutual support that could benefit all family members while addressing the competitive challenges and market changes that were affecting their respective businesses and professional activities. The conversation was characterized by genuine respect and collaborative problem-solving rather than the hierarchical dynamics that had dominated previous family interactions. When the evening concluded, I felt a sense of satisfaction and completion that went beyond the vindication of being recognized for my accomplishments. The transformation of our family relationships from exclusion and dismissal to inclusion and respect represented a victory that was more meaningful than any financial success or business achievement I had accomplished independently. They had rewritten the family tree without me, but together we were now writing a new chapter that included everyone's contributions and recognized everyone's value. The drive home gave me time to reflect on the journey that had brought me from family disappointment to respected family leader and strategic advisor. The years of dismissal and exclusion had been painful, but they had also provided the motivation and freedom necessary to develop capabilities and build relationships that would not have been possible within the constraints of traditional family expectations and established business practices. The expertise I had developed and the wealth I had accumulated were tools that could be used to create positive change and address global challenges that affected millions of people. The influence I had acquired over my family's assets and operations was an opportunity to demonstrate that business success and social responsibility were complementary rather than competing objectives. The relationships I had built with innovative entrepreneurs and sustainable business leaders provided access to resources and opportunities that could benefit multiple generations of Hamilton descendants. My phone displayed several text messages from my siblings expressing gratitude for the patience and grace I had shown during the difficult conversation about their past treatment of me and excitement about the possibilities for future collaboration and mutual support. Margaret's message included an invitation to present my perspectives on sustainable business practices to the partners at Hamilton and Associates who were interested in developing expertise in emerging legal areas. Thomas had sent information about the specific operational challenges his manufacturing company was facing and asked whether companies in my investment portfolio might be able to provide solutions that could improve efficiency while reducing environmental impact. Sarah's message included research proposals that could benefit from connections to biotechnology companies and investment networks that understood the commercial potential of medical innovations. Father's message was brief but meaningful, expressing respect for what I had accomplished and appreciation for my willingness to share my expertise and resources with family members who had not always treated me with the consideration I deserved. He asked whether I would be interested in working together to restructure family investment strategies in ways that could provide better returns while supporting businesses and technologies that addressed global challenges. The family tree they had rewritten without me was being rewritten once again, but this time the story would include everyone's contributions and recognize everyone's potential for creating value and making a difference in the world. The dismissal and exclusion that had defined my relationship with my family for over a decade had been replaced by inclusion and respect that was based on demonstrated confidence and shared commitment to using our resources responsibly. The future held opportunities for collaboration and mutual support that could benefit not only our family, but also the broader community of entrepreneurs, researchers, and innovators who were working to address global challenges through sustainable business practices and technological innovation. The influence I had acquired was not an end in itself, but a means for creating positive change and building a legacy that would be worthy of the Hamilton family's 5-generation commitment to making a meaningful contribution to the world. As I entered my apartment building and rode the elevator to my floor, I realized that the transformation I had undergone was not just about achieving financial success or gaining recognition from family members who had previously dismissed my potential. It was about proving that different approaches to business and investment could generate superior results while creating positive social and environmental impact that would benefit future generations. The contracts and legal documents that had been signed that morning represented more than strategic positioning for family negotiations. They represented a commitment to using wealth and influence responsibly and ethically in ways that created opportunities for others and addressed challenges that affected entire communities and ecosystems. The vindication I had achieved was meaningful because it demonstrated that sustainable and socially responsible business practices were not just morally superior, but also financially superior to traditional approaches that prioritized short-term profits over long-term value creation. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to continue building bridges between innovative entrepreneurs and traditional businesses, between sustainable investment strategies and conventional wealth management, between family relationships and professional collaboration. The story that had begun with exclusion and dismissal had evolved into a narrative of inclusion and mutual respect that could serve as a model for other families and organizations that were struggling to adapt to changing economic and social conditions. The daughter they had written out of their family tree had become the person most capable of ensuring that the Hamilton family legacy would continue to grow and evolve in ways that honored both traditional values and emerging opportunities for creating positive change in an interconnected and rapidly changing world.